The ancestors whispered warnings in the wind that swept across Lagos International Airport that morning, but Apostle Johnson Selman was too focused on his mission to hear them. The red earth beneath his feet seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of a continent that had watched too many of its children walk through doors of humiliation, their dignity stripped away layer by layer like bark from an ancient baobab tree. "Ehen," the old women would say, "when the lion walks among hyenas, they forget he is king." Apostle Johnson Selman adjusted his simple black suit. Not the elaborate robes that marked him as a man of God in his homeland, but the understated garment of a servant called to carry light into dark places. His weathered hands, scarred from years of building churches with his own labor, gripped the handle of his worn leather briefcase. Inside lay the invitation that had changed everything: a speaking engagement at the International Conference of Faith Leaders in Geneva, Switzerland. "Pastor, you sure say you no want make I follow you go?" his assistant, Brother Chinedu, had asked him the night before, concern etched across his Igbo features like ancient tribal marks. "MBA, my son," Selman had replied, mixing English with his native Hausa. "Some journeys a man must walk alone. The Most High has shown me this path in dreams." Now, standing in the departure lounge, surrounded by the cacophony of a dozen Nigerian languages, Yoruba traders haggling over the phone, Hausa pilgrims preparing for Lesser Hajj, Igbo businessmen discussing deals, Selman felt the weight of ancestral eyes upon him. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, "NWM, when you travel to the land of the white man, remember you carry not just yourself, but the prayers of your fathers." The boarding announcement crackled through speakers worn thin by humidity and overuse. "Passengers for flight LH568 to Frankfurt with connecting service to Geneva, please proceed to gate 12. As Johnson Selman walked toward the gate, his mind wandered to the red clay churches he had built across northern Nigeria, their walls rising from earth the color of dried blood, their foundations deep enough to withstand both harmattan winds and the storms of persecution. Each brick had been laid with prayer, each beam raised with songs that connected him to something deeper than doctrine, to the very soil that had birthed his people. The airplane loomed before him like a metallic bird of prey, its German engineering a stark contrast to the organic curves of the African landscape he was leaving behind. As he climbed the steps, the last breath of Lagos air filled his lungs, thick with the scent of palm oil, exhaust fumes, and the indefinable essence of home. Inside the aircraft, the air was sterile, recycled, stripped of the living breath that connected all things. Johnson Selman found his seat in economy class, though the conference organizers had offered to upgrade him. "A servant of the Most High travels as his people travel," he had insisted, earning puzzled looks from his European contacts. The airplane was perhaps half full, scattered with the usual mix of international travelers. Selman settled into his window seat, pulling out a small leather-bound journal where he recorded his prayers and prophecies. His pen had barely touched the page when she appeared. The air hostess moved down the aisle like a predator marking territory, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch her pale features into a mask of professional disdain. Her name tag read, Ingrid, and her eyes, ice blue and calculating, swept over the passengers with the efficiency of a machine sorting wheat from chaff. When her gaze fell upon Apostle Selman, something shifted in the atmosphere of the cabin. He felt it immediately, the sudden cooling of the air around him, as if ancestral spirits had suddenly drawn back in warning. Her eyes narrowed, taking in his dark skin, his modest clothing, the way he held himself with quiet dignity despite the cramped conditions. "Entschuldigung," she said, her German accent thick with barely concealed irritation. "Excuse me, sir. I need to see your ticket." Selman looked up from his journal, noting the way she emphasized "sir," as if the word tasted bitter on her tongue. Around them, other passengers, mostly white Europeans and Americans, were settling in without harassment. But he had learned long ago to choose his battles wisely. "Of course, sister," he said gently, reaching into his jacket pocket. His voice carried the musical cadence of someone who had learned English as a second language but spoke it with the poetry of one who understood that words were vessels for the spirit. Ingrid's face hardened at the word, sister. She snatched the ticket from his hand with unnecessary force, her fingers avoiding any contact with his skin as if his blackness might be contagious. "This seat is for business-class passengers only," she announced loudly, her voice carrying across the cabin like a town crier spreading news of a criminal's shame. Selman's eyes remained calm, but those who knew him well would have recognized the stillness that came over him. The same quietness that preceded the most powerful of his prophecies. "Sister, please check again. This is my assigned seat." "I don't think so," Ingrid replied, not bothering to look at the ticket properly. "Economy passengers are in the back." Follow me. She turned and began walking toward the rear of the plane, expecting him to follow like a chastened child. But Selman remained seated, his weathered hands folded over his journal. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, ready to snap. Other passengers began to notice the commotion. An elderly German businessman in the row ahead turned to watch, his eyes curious but not sympathetic. A young American couple whispered to each other, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and fascination at the unfolding drama. Ingrid wheeled around, her heels clicking against the cabin floor like the sound of breaking bones. "Sir, I asked you to move. This is not your seat." "Sister," Selman said, his voice still gentle but now carrying an undertone that seemed to resonate from some deep place, "I have shown you my ticket. This is seat 12A. This is where the Most High has placed me today." The mention of God seemed to inflame her further. Her cheeks flushed red, and her voice dropped to a hiss designed to carry maximum humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability. "Look, I don't know what kind of scheme you're running, but this is a respectable airline. We don't tolerate people trying to upgrade themselves without authorization. Now move to the back where you belong or I'll have security remove you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a burning village. "Where you belong." The phrase echoed with centuries of violence, with the sound of chains and the crack of whips, with the institutional machinery that had spent generations telling people like Selman exactly where they belonged. An elderly African woman seated several rows back, a professor returning from a conference, though Ingrid had dismissed her as just another economic migrant, caught Selman's eye. Her nod was almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of shared understanding. "We see you, brother. We know this dance." Selman reached into his jacket and withdrew his phone, pulling up his email confirmation. The screen showed clearly, Seat 12A business class, paid for by the International Conference of Faith Leaders. He held it toward Ingrid without a word. She barely glanced at it. "Anyone can fake these things. I'm calling security." "Before you do that," Selman said, rising slowly to his full height, "perhaps you should call your supervisor." Something in his voice, not threatening, but carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard, made Ingrid pause. For the first time she seemed to actually look at him rather than through him. She took in the quality of his suit despite its simplicity, the expensive leather of his briefcase, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. But prejudice, once awakened, is not easily put back to sleep. "I don't need to call anyone," she snapped. "I can handle troublemakers myself." Eric Wa, Selman whispered under his breath, a Hausa expression his grandmother had taught him, meaning patience in tribulation. The ancestors had faced worse than this. His own grandfather had survived the colonial period, when British officials treated African chiefs like unruly children. His father had built a successful trading business despite laws designed to keep black entrepreneurs in poverty. The spirits of those who came before seemed to gather around him now, their presence as real as the recycled air he breathed. They whispered ancient wisdom. The river that flows quietly carves the deepest channel. An older German man in a clerical collar, a Lutheran pastor returning from missionary work in Kenya, finally spoke up. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help noticing. Is there a problem here?" Ingrid turned to him with a smile that was all warmth and professional courtesy. "No problem at all, Pastor Mueller. Just a seating mix-up. We'll have it sorted shortly." The contrast was stark, the way her entire demeanor shifted when addressing the white clergyman. Her voice became musical, accommodating, designed to put him at ease. It was a masterclass in the subtle choreography of racism, performed with such practiced skill that it would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But Pastor Mueller had spent years in Africa. He recognized the signs. "Perhaps I could help clarify things," he suggested mildly. "I believe this gentleman mentioned he was attending a religious conference in Geneva?" Selman nodded. "The International Conference of Faith Leaders. I am scheduled to speak on the theology of liberation in post-colonial Africa." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Here was not some confused economic migrant or fraudulent passenger, but a distinguished religious leader, a colleague. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. An African apostle being humiliated by a flight attendant while traveling to speak about the very systems of oppression he was experiencing in real time. Ingrid's face went through a series of calculations. She was trapped now between her prejudices and the growing awareness that she might have made a catastrophic error in judgment. But rather than back down gracefully, she doubled down. "I don't care what conference he claims to be attending," she said, her voice rising. "Rules are rules. He doesn't belong in business class." The words seemed to echo through the cabin, and suddenly other passengers were no longer pretending not to notice. A black American businessman pulled out his phone and began recording. An Indian family whispered among themselves in Hindi, their faces troubled. Even some of the white passengers shifted uncomfortably, sensing that they were witnessing something that would stay with them long after the flight ended. Selman closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, something had changed. The quiet man of God was still there, but now he was joined by something else. The accumulated dignity of his ancestors, the righteous anger of the oppressed, the prophetic fire that had made him a powerful voice for justice in his homeland. "Sister," he said, his voice still gentle but now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the cabin, "I need you to understand something. I'm not just a passenger on this airplane. I am a son of Africa, carrying the prayers of my people. I am a servant of the Most High, called to speak truth to power. And right now you are the power and I am the truth." He gestured toward his seat. This ticket was purchased with money donated by widows and orphans in Nigeria who wanted to see their pastor carry their stories to the world. Every naira came from people who have faced exactly the kind of treatment you are showing me now. They scrimp and save not for themselves, but so that voices like mine can be heard in rooms where decisions are made about their futures. His voice began to carry the rhythm of the pulpit, the cadence of oral tradition, the music of a people who had learned to make their pain into poetry. You see a black man in your business class and you assume he doesn't belong. But I want you to know who I am. I am the grandson of a woman who was forced to carry water for British colonial officers. I am the son of a man who was denied service in shops owned by Lebanese merchants who considered themselves above the natives. I am the product of a people who have been told for centuries that we don't belong in the places of power and privilege. The cabin had grown completely silent. Even the usual sounds of the aircraft seemed muted, as if the machine itself was holding its breath. "But here is what you don't understand," Selman continued, his voice gaining strength. "We belong everywhere we choose to be. We belong in boardrooms and classrooms, in pulpits and parliaments, in business class and first class and any other space where human beings gather to do the work of building a better world." Ingrid's face had gone pale and she seemed to be struggling for words. Around them, passengers were openly staring now, some with smartphones raised, others simply transfixed by the unfolding drama. An African-American woman in row 15 began to clap slowly, and the sound echoed through the cabin like distant thunder. Soon others joined her. The Indian family, the elderly professor, even some of the white passengers who recognized courage when they saw it. But Selman raised his hand in silence. He wasn't finished. "You asked me to move to the back, sister. To go where I belong. But I need you to understand something about belonging. My ancestors were forced into the backs of ships, chained like cargo. My grandparents were forced to the backs of buses, denied the dignity of choice. My parents were forced to the backs of lines, told to wait their turn while others jumped ahead." His voice dropped to nearly a whisper, but somehow everyone in the cabin could hear him clearly. "But we survived all of that. We built universities from nothing. We created businesses that span continents. We raised children who became doctors and lawyers and yes, even religious leaders who get invited to speak at international conferences. We learned that our belonging isn't determined by where others put us, but by where God calls us to be." He looked directly at Ingrid and for the first time she met his eyes without flinching. "So when you tell me to move to the back, you're not just asking me to change seats. You're asking me to accept a lie that my people have been fighting against for centuries. You're asking me to teach my children and my grandchildren that we are still cargo, still second class, still not quite human enough to sit wherever our tickets say we can sit." The tears came then, not from Selman but from unexpected places throughout the cabin. The American businessman who had been recording wiped his eyes. The Indian father hugged his teenage daughter closer. Even Pastor Mueller bowed his head in what looked like prayer or shame or both. "I cannot do that, sister," Selman said softly. "Not for you, not for this airline, not for anyone. Because I am not just representing myself today. I am representing every person who has ever been told they don't belong somewhere they have every right to be." The silence that followed was profound, the kind of quiet that follows revelation. In that moment, the cabin became a kind of sanctuary, a place where truth had been spoken and everyone present had been forced to reckon with it. Finally Ingrid spoke, her voice barely audible. I need to check with my supervisor." She walked toward the front of the plane on unsteady legs, her professional composure completely shattered. The other passengers watched her go, then turned back to Selman with a mixture of admiration and something approaching awe. The elderly African professor rose from her seat and walked forward, her traditional Ankara cloth dress bright against the aircraft's neutral palette. Without asking permission, she sat in the empty seat beside Selman. "Nduo Nyam," she said in Igbo, then switched to English. "My name is Professor Adaora Okafor. I teach African Studies at the University of Cape Town. I wanted to thank you for what you just did." Selman nodded respectfully. "Sister, I only spoke the truth. Sometimes that is all we can do." "You did more than that," she replied. "You gave every person in this cabin a choice. You showed them what dignity looks like, what it costs, and what it's worth." Around them, other passengers were beginning to move. The American businessman came forward and handed Selman his business card. "I'm Marcus Johnson," he said. "I run a foundation that funds educational programs in underserved communities. I'd like to support your work if you're interested." The Indian father approached with his daughter, a girl of perhaps 16 with intelligent eyes and a defiant tilt to her chin. "My daughter has been facing discrimination at her school in London," he said quietly. "Some of the other students, they say things. Tell her she doesn't belong." I didn't know how to help her respond. Now I do. One by one, passengers made their way forward, not to gawk or intrude, but to acknowledge what they had witnessed. An elderly white woman from Munich apologized for people like that girl, and asked if there was anything she could do to help. A young Nigerian medical student studying in Germany thanked Selman for showing them who we really are. The cabin had transformed from a sterile tube of recycled air into something resembling a community, bound together by shared witness to a moment of truth. 20 minutes later, Ingrid returned with a man in captain's stripes, tall, graying, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years in the cockpit. His name tag identified him as Captain Hans Weber, and his expression was carefully neutral as he approached Selman's row. "Sir," he said in accented English, "I understand there was some confusion about your seating assignment." Selman studied the captain's face, looking for signs of the same prejudice that had animated his subordinate. Instead, he saw something else, embarrassment, perhaps, or professional concern about an incident that had clearly gotten out of hand. "There was no confusion about my seat, Captain," Selman replied evenly. "Only confusion about whether I belonged in it." Captain Weber nodded slowly. "I have reviewed your booking confirmation. You are absolutely correct. This is your assigned seat, and I apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced." The apology was professionally delivered but felt genuine. Behind the captain, Ingrid stood with her eyes fixed on the floor, her earlier defiance replaced by what looked like genuine shame. "Furthermore," the captain continued, "as a gesture of goodwill, the airline would like to offer you an upgrade to first class for the remainder of your journey." A murmur of approval went through the cabin, but Selman shook his head. "Thank you, Captain, but I will remain here. My people in Nigeria sacrificed to buy this ticket. To accept an upgrade would be to suggest that their sacrifice was not enough, that their money was somehow inferior. I am honored to sit in the seat their love purchased." The captain's respect was visible in his expression. "I understand completely. Is there anything else we can do to ensure the remainder of your flight is comfortable?" "Perhaps," Selman said quietly, "your crew member could benefit from some education about the passengers she serves. Not everyone who looks different is trying to take something they haven't earned. Some of us are simply trying to get to places where we can serve others." Captain Weber nodded gravely. "You have my word that this will be addressed thoroughly." He turned to Ingrid. "Miss Hoffman, please return to your duties. We will speak privately after we land." As the captain and chastened flight attendant retreated, the cabin slowly returned to its normal pre-flight routine. But something fundamental had shifted. Passengers who had been strangers began talking to each other. The American businessman struck up a conversation with the Nigerian medical student about scholarship opportunities. The Indian family discussed their experiences with Professor Okafor. Even some of the European passengers seemed more aware of their fellow travelers, more willing to make eye contact and acknowledge shared humanity. Selman returned to his journal, but found himself unable to write. The encounter had drained him emotionally, but it had also filled him with something else. A sense of prophetic purpose, of being used as an instrument for something larger than himself. The airplane finally pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway. As Lagos fell away beneath them, Selman pressed his face to the window and watched the red earth of his homeland shrink into the distance. But he carried it with him, in his voice, in his bearing, in the quiet authority that came from being rooted in something deeper than mere personal achievement. Somewhere over the Sahara Desert, as the aircraft cruised at 35,000 feet, Professor Okafor leaned over to speak to him. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "what happened back there, it wasn't really about airline seats." Selman nodded. "No, sister. It was about the same thing it's always been about. The right to exist as fully human in spaces that weren't designed for us. Do you think it made a difference? She asked. Do you think that girl learned anything? Selman considered the question seriously. Perhaps. But even if she didn't, everyone else on this airplane learned something. They learned that dignity is not negotiable. They learned that there are still people willing to stand up for what is right, even when it's uncomfortable. He paused, looking out at the vast expanse of desert below. The same desert his ancestors had traveled for centuries, carrying trade goods and wisdom, building empires and universities long before Europe emerged from its dark ages. But mostly, he continued, they learned that we are still here. Still proud. Still unbroken. Still carrying the light of our ancestors into dark places that need illumination. The remainder of the flight passed peacefully. Ingrid avoided their section of the cabin, but other crew members went out of their way to be helpful and respectful. When they landed in Frankfurt for the connection to Geneva, several passengers approached Selman to exchange contact information or simply to shake his hand. As he walked through the terminal, Selman reflected on the morning's events. In a few hours he would be standing before an audience of international religious leaders, speaking about liberation theology and the continuing struggle for dignity in post-colonial Africa. The irony was not lost on him. He had experienced a perfect example of his lecture topic at 35,000 feet. But there was something else, something that felt like the working of providence in the whole affair. Every person on that aircraft had been forced to choose sides, to decide whether they would stand with dignity or remain silent in the face of injustice. Most had chosen correctly, and in doing so, they had become part of something larger than themselves. The ancestors whispered approval in the recycled air of the Frankfurt terminal. The young man who had left Lagos that morning carrying the prayers of his people had been tested and found worthy. He had spoken truth to power, and power had been forced to listen. In Geneva, his speech would be well received. He would speak of the ongoing struggle for dignity, of the ways systemic racism manifests in everyday interactions, of the spiritual strength required to maintain one's humanity in the face of dehumanizing treatment. The audience would nod appreciatively and applaud politely, treating it as academic discourse. But the passengers on that flight had experienced the living reality of those words. They had seen dignity in action, had witnessed the power of speaking truth with love rather than anger, had been forced to confront their own complicity in systems of oppression. And perhaps that was the real purpose of the journey, not just to speak to the converted in a conference hall, but to plant seeds of change in the hearts of ordinary people who would return to their ordinary lives carrying an extraordinary memory of what courage looks like. As his connecting flight boarded, Selman offered a quiet prayer of gratitude. He had been chosen to be a vessel for something important, a living example of the very principles he taught. The humiliation intended to diminish him had instead become a platform for truth, a stage for the ancestors to speak through him to a world that still needed to hear their message. The red earth of Nigeria was thousands of miles behind him now, but it lived in his blood, in his voice, in the unshakable certainty that he belonged wherever his feet chose to stand. And in a small but significant way, the world was a little more just because he had refused to accept anything less than the full dignity of his humanity. The river that flows quietly, he remembered his grandmother saying, carves the deepest channel. Today he had been that river, and the channel he carved would carry the flow of justice for generations to come.